and military strategy. In the next 3 years, will the United States and Europe be capable of pursuing such a strategy, or will they leave a bigger mess than in 2001? Finding a solution to these problems is the purpose of this book. Chapter 2: Pakistan in Crisis. When Barack Obama took office in January 2009, the crisis for Pakistan's people, the region, and the international community was far larger than even the perceptive president could have realized. 2 weeks before he became president, he understood that Pakistan, whose problems, policies, and needs the Bush administration had largely ignored, might pose a greater danger to regional stability than even Afghanistan. Yet without Pakistan's help and compliance, no successful U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan or reduction in Taliban violence could happen. The term AFPAC is used for the region colloquially, but in every aspect and plan, Pakistan had to come first. What was the United States to do about Pakistan the problem, Pakistan the ally, Pakistan the asset, and eventually Pakistan the partial solution? There were no immediate answers. Now in the autumn of 2011, relations between the two countries have slipped catastrophically to the lowest point ever, worse than anyone can remember, in an always tumultuous roller-coaster relationship. The United States and Pakistan are just short of going to war. Obama has tried to address the Pakistan issue with far more comprehensive policies than Bush ever did, but he has failed to sustain them, or to unite his administration around them, or to provide sufficient political or monetary support to change the Pakistan Army's all-consuming psychological obsession with India. Pakistan has a litany of problems, some of which involve the military. It refuses either to acknowledge or to end its covert support for the Afghan Taliban. It drags its feet on seeking a settlement with India. The anti-state Pakistani Taliban is growing. The military refuses to handle politically the separatist insurgency that has erupted in Baluchistan province. Extremism in the army's ranks and concerns about the safety of Pakistan's nuclear weapons cause international apprehension. The military leadership fears that its officers and soldiers are becoming more intensely anti-American and so more susceptible to extremist propaganda. On the other hand, the civilian government and the political parties refuse to address a wave of extremist intolerance against minority groups, both non-Muslim and Muslim. They take no responsibility for providing services to the public while indulging in large-scale corruption. They allow an unprecedented economic meltdown to become worse by declining to carry out reforms or listen to international advice. An energy crisis turns the lights off for up to 18 hours a day and undermines production. They fail to disarm militants or address the situation in Karachi, where ethnic and criminal bloodletting leaves scores of people dead every month. Pakistan faces diplomatic isolation, as its relations with all major countries except for China are souring dramatically. Devastating floods in 2010 and 2011 and an epidemic of dengue, malarial fever in Punjab in 2011 were unavoidable, but governmental concern and aid delivery were totally inadequate. Pakistanis are beginning to fear the worst: international isolation, anarchy, civil war, a coup by Islamic militants. As I discussed in Descent into Chaos, U.S.-Pakistan relations in the aftermath of 9/11 were tortuous. A deadly branch of the Taliban emerged in Pakistan, which, despite many warnings by experts, the army never anticipated. But to understand why Pakistan's political and military elites have taken the direction they have, we need to take a longer view of the country's weaknesses and strengths. 4 factors have prevented Pakistan from stabilizing and becoming a cohesive state. First, its political elite has failed to establish a coherent national identity capable of uniting the nation. The very subject remains deeply contentious. Is Pakistan an Islamic state, or is it a state for Muslims that has space for other religions and ethnic minorities? Is it not a democratic state, as envisioned by its founder Muhammad Ali Jinnah? Are its people Muslims first, Siddhis or Punjabis second, and Pakistanis third? Or are they Pakistanis first and foremost? The military defines Pakistani national identity defensively, in terms of the country's vulnerability as a national security state, with a permanent mistrust of India. The politicians in power have never seriously tried to challenge this isolating self-definition by offering alternative policies, such as promoting good neighborliness, ending support for Islamic extremism, fostering economic development, and providing education. The Pakistani Taliban, for their part, would define Pakistan in religious terms. They call for the establishment of a state based on Sharia or Islamic law, and for a caliphate, a supranational entity that would dissolve Pakistan's borders and aid and abet Islamic extremism and al-Qaeda. The extremists lack sufficient support to seize state power, but they have a proven ability to disrupt the state and foment anarchy. By 2011, the Pakistani Taliban were a much more dangerous entity than even the Afghan Taliban. The Pashtun tribesmen who made up the original core of the Pakistani Taliban had been joined by militants from Punjab, Karachi, and other places that had been involved in the war in Kashmir. They provided a sophisticated, educated, and urban edge to the terrorist war they now waged against Pakistan's security forces and civilians. Second, all these groups had camps in Fatah, where they willingly trained foreigners, especially European Muslims from countries such as Britain, Germany, and Sweden. These students then returned home to become terrorists. Third, they were far more ideologically extreme than their Afghan brothers and could depend on a far larger pool of recruits as fighters and suicide bombers. By 2011, the main Afghan Taliban had expressed their desire to talk with the Kabul government and the Americans, but the Pakistani Taliban were still adamant about Pakistan's destruction. The second factor dividing the country is Pakistan's national security paradigm. Is it to remain India-centric, as determined by the military, or is it to adopt an alternative vision, as advocated by civil society and the progressive political elite? The long-running civilian-military rift that underlies these two views has contributed to the Army's rule of Pakistan for nearly half the country's existence. Whenever the Army feels that its control over national security is being challenged, usually in the midst of a political, constitutional, economic crisis, when an incompetent and corrupt civilian government is at the helm, it invariably overthrows the government and imposes military rule. This has happened 4 times in Pakistan's history, and military rule has often lasted a decade or more. In the military's view, Pakistan is constantly threatened by outside enemies, in particular India, but at times also Afghanistan, Iran, or the United States. In order to stand up to this perceived threatening environment, it maintains an army of 600,000 men, the 7th largest in the world. Its total security forces number more than 1 million men, armed with nearly 100 nuclear weapons. The military consumes between 25 and 30% of the budget. It is able to secure those state resources because the political elite is supine and corrupt. Parliament does not insist on accountability, and the Army retains control of foreign policy, national security, and the nuclear arsenal. No enlightened military leaders have arisen to try to change this status quo, despite the spread of democracy and the demise of authoritarian forms of government around the world. Third, Pakistan has become an abnormal state that uses Islamic militants, jihadi groups, non-state actors, in addition to diplomacy and trade, to pursue its defense and foreign policies. These non-state actors have deeply antagonized its neighbors, all of whom have, at one time or another, felt their pressure. After September 11, 2001, the Army's policies did not change, even though the whole world was now deeply aware of the threat posed by Islamic extremist forces and was less than tolerant toward them. Yet Pakistan's location gives it enormous geostrategic potential. It borders Central, South, and West Asia, is a gateway to the sea for China, and is situated at the mouth of the Arabian Gulf. No other country in the world has such potential to become a hub for trade and business or the transcontinental transport of energy. Even India would find it far more useful to use Pakistan as an investment hub and a leaping-off point to access Central and West Asia than to be in conflict with it, The country lacks major natural resources like oil, but if it were at peace with its neighbors and with itself, Pakistan would become the great trading crossroads of the world, ensuring stability in the region. Islamic militant proxies would have no need to terrify the neighbors. Yet the army and the political elite have never tried to create such a Pakistan. They have always perceived the country as vulnerable and indefensible, and regarded every other government as a potential threat. Because of these fears, they support strategic depth and a pliable Afghan government that could aid Pakistan in times of war with India. This absurd theory, which I contradicted in my 2000 book, Taliban, nonetheless persists and prevents the military from developing a rational policy toward Afghanistan. The fourth factor perpetuating Pakistan's fragility is the inability of its ethnic groups to find a working political balance with one another, and the failure of Pakistan's political system, its parties, and its army to help them do so. Punjab, the second largest province geographically, contains 60% of the country's population. 70% of the army and a large part of the bureaucracy are drawn from Punjab. Punjab is also the most ethnically homogeneous province, with the vast majority of its population being Punjabi. The Baluch, Sindhis, and Pashtuns have at one time or other all felt underprivileged and resentful of the Punjabis. Punjabis constitute 60% of the population, so all the other nationalities put together cannot equal Punjab's weight in determining economic or national policy. Moreover, the other three provinces, Baluchistan, Sindh, and Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, KP, are often at odds with one another over issues such as distribution of water and electricity. For the smaller provinces, Punjab also constitutes the center of the state, because it is from Punjab that the bulk of the army and the bureaucracy is recruited. As a result of Punjab's dominance, resentment from the smaller provinces has ebbed and flowed over the years. They have mounted everything from political resistance and civil unrest to terrorism and separatist guerrilla wars. The current insurgency in Baluchistan province is the fifth of its kind. Hence the absence of a shared national identity that transcends ethnicity, tribe, religion, and language is a lingering problem for Pakistan. If Pakistan were a trading hub and a regional crossroads using all its territory, all its ethnic groups would have a stake in it. The military and the political elite are both to blame for perpetuating the four factors and for failing to forge Pakistani unity. The major political parties are run as family dynasties rather than democratic institutions, and they have rarely offered modernizing policies that would reform the economy or society. They have rarely tried to live up to their responsibilities to the people. Civilian rule in the 1990s by Benazir Bhutto and Nawaz Sharif, who were twice popularly elected to power and twice deposed by a combination of the army and the presidency, made Pakistan a byword for corruption and mismanagement. Meanwhile, the long bouts of military rule, in which politicians were jailed or exiled, have made it unthinkable for educated young people to enter politics. The politicians' failure has sustained the army's strong anti-civilian prejudice and more recently fueled public antagonism toward politicians and the democratic system. Such conditions have only helped Islamic extremists present themselves as incorruptible, clean, alternative rulers. These internal conflicts within the country's elite have prevented the rulers from noticing major shifts and challenges in the global environment. They have allowed history to pass them by, with the result that Pakistan has missed out on all recent global developments. The end of the Cold War, in 1991 through 92, spelled the end of superpower aid for all third-world countries. In order to survive, middle- and low-income countries were forced to practice good neighborliness, build regional trade alliances, develop new industries, and find new markets for their goods. Hence, the rapid expansion of the European Union, EU, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, SCO, and other such economic blocs. But Pakistan spent the 1990s at loggerheads with all its neighbors. Early in the decade, the conflict with India escalated dramatically, as the army supported jihadi groups to fight in Indian Kashmir, while Islamabad's support for the Taliban regime kept relations with Iran and the Central Asian republics tense and competitive over Afghanistan. Many Pakistanis talked of building roads, railways, and oil pipelines that would link Central Asia via Afghanistan with the port of Karachi. Many talked of the potential of the new Chinese-built port of Gwadar on the Baluchistan coast. But nothing could come of such dreams as long as a civil war raged in Afghanistan, an insurgency continued in Baluchistan, and an isolated Pakistan continued to support the Taliban. The peace and economic dividend at the end of the Cold War that benefited many countries rolled by Pakistan unnoticed. Meanwhile, globalization built interlinked prosperity and new industries in many third-world countries. India surged ahead. It adapted quickly to globalization, carrying out major economic reforms and encouraging its private sector. India's boom could have accelerated a similar expansion in Pakistan if the two neighbors had had better trade ties. But instead, globalization passed Pakistan by. Many educated Pakistanis had no idea of the dramatic economic changes being wrought on the world stage, as Pakistan continued to export its traditional raw materials like cotton and rice, fought its proxy wars in Kashmir and Afghanistan, and stagnated. In the past 20 years, it has not developed a single new industry or cultivated a major new crop, even though it is an agricultural country. Globalization made it vital for Pakistan to spend money on education, to upgrade the skills of its workforce, and to invest in new industries. Instead, Musharraf fueled a consumption-based economy that rested on personal and state debt. September 11, 2001, was another wake-up call for Pakistan to end its dependence on jihadi groups as a surrogate for conducting foreign policy. After al-Qaeda's attack on the U.S. mainland, the world was clearly going to consider Islamic extremism the new enemy, and the United States would clearly use that threat to justify military intervention in other states. President Bush's message to Islamabad, "You are either with us or against us," was aimed at gaining Pakistan's support for the invasion of Afghanistan, but it was also a clear warning for the future. Hitherto, the United States had closed its eyes to Pakistani support for jihadist groups because of the presumed threat from India. But now that such groups had actually attacked the United States, Washington was no longer prepared to allow state sponsorship of them. But Pakistan's reaction was myopic. Musharraf thought he could still manipulate and massage the Bush message. While agreeing to support the United States against al-Qaeda, the ISI allowed jihadi groups to intensify their attacks in India and Kashmir, which, after the attack on the Indian Parliament in 2001, nearly led to war with India. In 2003, the ISI helped revive the Taliban insurgency in Afghanistan. By 2005, as I pointed out in Descent into Chaos, a major confrontation between the United States and Pakistan was clearly inevitable, and it did occur in 2010 and 2011. The last decade has also brought fundamental changes in national belief systems around the world, but not yet in Pakistan. A country's military strength, its nuclear weapons, its geostrategic ambitions, and its influence over its neighbors are worthless if, as is the case with Pakistan, its economy is weak, its people are illiterate, and its youth are jobless. The rapid economic growth of India and China was the harbinger of their strength and regional influence. Pakistan, by contrast, has undertaken no major economic or social reforms since the early 1990s. The ruling elite refuses to tax itself or to invest its wealth in modernizing industry and agriculture. The state-run industries are bleeding the country, and the army refuses to cut its expenses even as it has expanded its own tax-free businesses and property empires. Only 1.8 million people pay income tax, and farmers pay no income tax, even though they are the best off due to the rapid rise in food prices. Corruption is rampant, and social services, especially education, remain abysmal, because every year the government spending on health and education is cut as military expenses increase. Literacy is at a miserable 57%, the lowest in South Asia. Neither the politicians nor the army has ever called for a massive literacy campaign. For the past 20 years, the country has lived off IMF loan programs, which have never been fully completed or complied with, because the various governments have refused to carry out the reforms demanded by the IMF. Other countries provide large amounts of aid, but Pakistan has very little to show for it. Between 2001 and 2010, the United States gave a total of $20.5 billion. Germany, Britain, Japan, and other donors, along with the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank, provided about half again that sum. Out of the U.S. funding, $14.4 billion went to the Pakistan Army for operations along the Afghan border, while only $6.1 billion was used as economic aid, and most of that, $4.8 billion, was for budgetary support. The United States was also generous on the humanitarian front when a dreadful earthquake hit northern Pakistan in 2005 and when floods destroyed much of the country's infrastructure in 2010. When Richard Holbrooke first visited Pakistan in 2009, Pakistanis admitted bluntly that they had nothing to show for all the U.S. aid. Not a hospital, a dam, or a university. Holbrooke set about rectifying the situation by arranging aid for the decrepit electrical power system. He and Senator John Kerry shepherded through Congress the Kerry-Lugar-Berman bill, which offered Pakistan's civilian sector $7.5 billion over 5 years, or $1.5 billion a year. It was the first time the United States would provide so much aid for the social and economic sector. The bill passed in 2009, and Obama signed it into law. Initially, the Army put up strong objections to the bill because it was conditioned on Pakistan doing more in the war on terror and strengthening democracy. Within 2 years, however, U.S. military aid was suspended due to the breakdown of U.S.-Pakistan relations after the killing of bin Laden. Thereafter, the possibility arose that China would step in to bail out Pakistan. But despite China's massive support for the government and the military, it provides nuclear reactors and weapons systems as well as strategic infrastructure projects. It has rarely given cash to Pakistan for budgetary support or for counterterrorism campaigns, both of which the United States was providing. The government and the military further exacerbate Pakistan's crisis-ridden state by constantly feeding the public false narratives that the United States, India, and Israel are conspiring to undermine Pakistan and ultimately to dismember the country. That the reason for the increase in Islamic extremism in Pakistan is the U.S. occupation of Afghanistan, that the United States and India are arming and funding the Pakistani Taliban to weaken Pakistan, that Osama bin Laden was never killed in Abbottabad, that the United States is intent on capturing Pakistan's nuclear weapons, and that if the United States were to leave Afghanistan, terrorism and suicide bombings would cease, and everything would return to normal. Indian External Intelligence, RAW, Research and Analysis Wing, abetted by the CIA, is said to be funding separatists in Baluchistan and Sindh to carry out acts of terrorism, while India lays down deep roots in Afghanistan. These lies and myths confuse the public and youth, prevail over objective or rational analysis, and make it easier to spread conspiracy theories. The political, intellectual, and media elites have never challenged them in a sustained way. Many journalists are on the government or ISI payroll, or receive other perks and privileges. Among the majority of academics, too, intellectual standards and honesty have been sorely lacking, except for a few superb scholars who refuse to compromise. Government servants, especially those in the foreign and interior ministries, tend to be subservient to the army, and groupthink disallows any real debate over policy. But because of these narratives, the rulers, for example, can relatively easily divert discussion of the death of bin Laden from the main issue, what he was doing for so many years living next to the Pakistan Military Academy in Abbottabad, to the issue of the United States violating Pakistan's sovereignty. Talk about Pakistan's vulnerability and India's demonhood can dominate the TV talk shows and newspapers, having an enormous impact on public perceptions. The military and government deny unrelentingly that Pakistan is doing anything untoward against its neighbors or is helping extremists. For 10 years, Islamabad has denied that Al-Qaeda, the Afghan Taliban, or the Haqqani network was ever based on its soil, even though most of their leaders have been captured or killed in Pakistan. In recent years, the military has admitted to the Americans that these groups are present in Pakistan, because the Army is also intent on getting negotiations going between these groups and the United States. But the Army will never admit it in public. In a social atmosphere where anything is believable, the extremists benefit most. The false narratives give excellent cover to anti-Indian jihadist groups such as Lashkar-e-Taiba, LT, that have been trained by the ISI and that have working relationships with Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. The Pakistani state does not merely protect these jihadist groups and allow them to recruit and train cadres and mobilize funds. It portrays them not as terrorists but as benign social workers. After the LT mounted attacks in Mumbai in 2008, Pakistan held LT leaders under discreet house arrest for a few weeks, then freed them. This non-punishment infuriated the United States, India, and the international community. Higher education has suffered enormously. The best teaching staff has left the country, so universities are unable to educate their students adequately. This is especially true in the Army. The Pakistan Army's prime institution, the National Defense University, NDU, in Islamabad, has seen a sad loss of intellectual rigor. In the past, the NDU, where all mid-career officers take courses, prided itself on allowing officers to hear dissident views and encouraged rigorous discussion. I lectured at the NDU for 15 years, until Musharraf banned me, along with half a dozen other writers and intellectuals who held different views on the Army's policies. Musharraf insisted, for example, that the 1999 Kargil War with India was a victory. Most Pakistanis in the world think the war was a humiliating defeat, but neither Musharraf nor the NDU will hear of it. Under Musharraf and Kayani, too, lecturers have been encouraged not to question the Army's dominant role in the polity. The NDU has even begun to give courses to civilians, politicians, and elected members of parliament. It teaches them the Army's interpretation of national security and politics, rather than learning from them the importance of democracy and civilian control over the armed forces. Ann Patterson, the U.S. ambassador who lectured there, was shocked to receive astonishingly naive and biased questions about America. She said officers have no chance to hear alternative views, even though many of them have children studying in the United States. The constantly tense military-civil relations dominate Pakistan's politics. 3 of the country's 4 military dictators were forced out of power by a mass movement, and simultaneously a constitutional crisis, an economic depression, and an increase in ethnic separatism. Every time a military regime is brought down, Pakistanis have to go back and reinvent the wheel of democracy. After a decade of military rule, civilian governments are invariably incompetent and corrupt, and only await their denouement at the hands of the next military coup. No elected government has yet been able to fulfill its whole-term mandate before being voted out of office through another election. Every military dictator, too, has been forced out, usually by his inability to get himself elected for a second term as a civilian rather than as a military president. In 2007, President Pervez Musharraf wanted to take off his uniform, end his long stint as army chief, and get elected as president for a second term, this time as a legitimate civilian. Few were prepared to accept that, even in the army. The political crisis that he generated before his resignation gave the extremists time and space to expand their area of operations. Ironically, it was the army and his chosen successor as army chief, General Ashfaq Parvez Kayani, who ultimately forced Musharraf out by refusing to back him any longer. The chaos and violence that preceded Musharraf's ouster portended the country's present political meltdown. In 2007, after a year of secret diplomacy and intense U.S. and British political pressure, Musharraf reluctantly agreed to allow Benazir Bhutto to return home from exile to contest the general election. Corruption charges against her would be dropped, and she could emerge as prime minister. In return, she would support Musharraf for a second term as president. But in March 2007, Musharraf tried to force the Supreme Court Chief Justice, Iftikhar Muhammad Chaudhry, to resign. Failing, Musharraf suspended him and placed him under house arrest. The public and lawyers were indignant, and Chaudhry's cause, a free and independent judiciary, led to street protests across the country. Then, on October 6, 2007, defying public sentiment, Musharraf got himself elected president by a puppet parliament for the second term. In Pakistan, the president or the head of state is elected by a majority of votes in parliament, while the chief executive or prime minister is elected through general elections. On October 18th, Benazir Bhutto returned to Karachi to a rapturous welcome. The day she arrived, a huge bomb exploded next to the truck she was traveling in, killing 140 people and leaving hundreds wounded. Bhutto demanded an international investigation into the attack. The carnage and Musharraf's refusal to accept her demand led to mounting public anger at Musharraf and acute strains between the two. The military had clearly neglected her security, despite promises made to the Americans. Senior members of her Pakistan People's Party, PPP, were convinced that elements from the intelligence agencies were responsible for the blast. Civil-military relations deteriorated even further. Bhutto's return to Pakistan had raised enormous hopes that she would restore democracy, curb extremism, and rebuild the economy. She had matured immensely since she was twice prime minister and had allowed her husband, Asif Ali Zardari, then known as Mr. 10%, to fix business deals. This time, Zardari had been told to stay home in Dubai and mind the kids. Bhutto was shocked by the growth of extremism, and as she toured the country, she took an ever-hardening line against the militants. Extremism, she said, looms as a threat, but it will be contained if the moderate middle can be mobilized to stand up to fanaticism. I returned to lead that battle. The militants were determined to stop her, while the army mistrusted her coming to power on the backs of the Americans and scorned her peace overtures to India and Afghanistan. Pakistan was then in the midst of the first wave of suicide attacks. The Pakistani Taliban had recently coalesced around al-Qaeda. Young Pashtun tribal and radical leaders from the tribal areas and mainstream Punjabi extremist groups that had fought in Kashmir. Radicalized through the madrasa, Islamic school network by years of fighting in Afghanistan, and angry at the army for cooling down the Kashmir jihad, they aimed to overthrow the Pakistani state. The Pakistani Taliban targeted the army, government officials, and civilians, while also helping the Afghan Taliban fight the Americans in Afghanistan. The federally administered tribal areas, FATA, where the militants coalesced, consist of 7 tribal agencies that border Afghanistan and the province of Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, KP, formerly the Northwest Frontier Province. The British had constituted these areas as a no-man's land between British India and Afghanistan, drawing the Durand Line right through the tribal areas, splitting them between Afghanistan and British India. Neither Afghanistan nor the Pashtun tribes have ever recognized this border, calling it arbitrary and claiming that the territory now in Pakistan belongs to Afghanistan. For a far more extensive description of FATA and events there in the ongoing conflict, see my Descent into Chaos. Briefly, the tribes in FATA have been particularly receptive to radicalization because of their history of poverty, underdevelopment and religious conviction, and their constant state of rebellion to protect their rights. With a population of just 3.5 million people, FATA has an immensely rugged terrain and little in the way of a modern economy, education, or prospects for its youth. 46% of the population works outside FATA. The literacy rate for women is one of the lowest in the world, at 3%, while for men it is only 15%. Compared to Pakistan's national average of 57%. The influx after 2001 of al-Qaeda and the Afghan Taliban into this region has acted like an economic and religious engine, driving the process of radicalization. Tribal resistance to the army began in 2004. The militants turned back each attack, enough to produce army defeats and humiliating ceasefires. That further emboldened them. Army attempts to raise local militias to fight them were a failure. The militants abandoned their traditional tribal chiefs and elders who usually supported the government and killed more than 1,000 of them. Tens of thousands of tribesmen fled Fatah. By 2010, the militants controlled almost all of Fatah. In 2007, the various militant tribal militias formed the Tehrik-e-Taliban Pakistan, TTP. That same year, militants openly confronted security forces at the siege of the Red Mosque in the heart of Islamabad. The army was forced to storm the mosque complex, killing more than 100 people. Those militants who survived escaped to Fatah and became suicide bombers. In 2007, there were 56 suicide bombings that killed 865 Pakistani security forces and civilians, compared with just 6 suicide attacks the previous year. The losses in 2007 exceeded the total losses for all years between 2001 and 2006. An internal civil war had begun. By 2011, more than 35,000 people would be killed, including 3,500 security personnel. Meanwhile, the political confrontation intensified. On November 3rd, to preempt a possible Supreme Court verdict against his re-election as president, Musharraf declared a state of emergency and arrested thousands of people, including Bhutto. Condemnation of Musharraf's second coup was worldwide. His actions even dismayed the army, which feared that his growing unpopularity would also affect them. Under pressure, Musharraf gave up his uniform and handed over the role of Army Chief of Staff to General Ashfaq Parvez Kayani, who had headed the ISI since 2004. Musharraf was now hugely unpopular, viewed as arrogant and overweening. His dictatorship now confined to a single person, his cabinet redundant, and parliament a rubber stamp. People wanted a return to full democracy, and Musharraf out of power. They looked to Bhutto to lead them. But on December 27, 2007, their hopes were traumatically dashed when she was assassinated just 2 weeks before the date of the general election. Her popularity and the widespread belief, never proved, that Musharraf's intelligence agents were responsible for her death led to violent countrywide protests for 3 days. The government produced a tape recording of an alleged telephone conversation involving Baitullah Masood, one of the leaders of the Pakistani Taliban, ostensibly taking responsibility for the murder. The real perpetrators are still not known. Musharraf made some callous remarks about her death that incensed the public. "You need 3 qualities today if you want to fight the extremists and the terrorists," he told Newsweek. "Number 1, you must have the military with you." Well, she was very unpopular with the military. Very unpopular. Number 2, you shouldn't be seen by the entire religious lobby to be alien, a non-religious person. The third element, don't be seen as an extension of the United States. Now, I am branded as an extension, but not to the extent she was. The PPP chose Bhutto's 19-year-old son, Bilawal Bhutto Zardari, as the new party chairman. As he was still studying at Oxford University, her immediate political successor became her controversial husband, Asif Ali Zardari. When the delayed election took place on February 18, 2008, Musharraf's party did badly, with 23 sitting ministers losing their seats. The PPP won 87 seats against the 66 seats won by the main opposition party, the Pakistan Muslim League Nawaz, PMLN, led by Nawaz Sharif. Zardari formed a coalition government with smaller parties that had done well in the provinces, and initially with the support of Nawaz Sharif. The voter turnout was just 45%, the lowest ever recorded and nearly 20 points less than the 63% turnout for the first free and fair elections in 1970. Fatah recorded the lowest turnout in its history, only 12%. All this indicated public disenchantment with democracy. The PPP suffers from personalized dynastic leadership, corruption, a feudal political base, incompetence, and a lack of technocrats. However, it is the only national party in Pakistan that still has support in all 4 provinces. All the other parties, including the PMLN, have become regional parties representing an ethnic group or a province. Zardari's electoral alliance included the Awami National Party, the main Pashtun anti-Taliban party in KP province, the Mutahida Qawmi movement in Sindh, the party of the Urdu-speaking population, and nationalist groups in Baluchistan. The election produced the first genuine national government that had support from all the major ethnic groups. It raised hopes for stability and progress. The extremists challenged the election by creating mayhem in the streets. In the first 10 weeks of 2008, 17 suicide bombings killed nearly 300 people and left the country reeling. The Pakistani Taliban controlled the main roads out of Peshawar and besieged the city. Only months later did the army regain control. Kidnappings for ransom rose dramatically in KP and Fatah, where on June 25th, Baitullah Masood executed 28 members of a tribal peace group who had met with the Pakistani Taliban. The new government had no clear plan on how to deal with the escalating violence and left all decision-making to the army. The war in Fatah left 1.5 million people displaced, while the year-long unrest created a severe economic and energy crisis with chronic shortages of gas, electricity, and fuel. Musharraf, a recipient of more than $10 billion in aid from the United States, had failed to build a single electricity-generating station. Zardari set up the Friends of Pakistan Forum to beg traditional donor countries for more money, but they refused to oblige until the government first carried out major economic reforms. To stave off a default, the government signed an agreement with the IMF for a loan of $11.3 billion, promising to implement economic reforms. After a decade of military rule, General Kayani wanted to distance the army from Musharraf and improve its image. He also wanted to be his own man, and that meant getting rid of Musharraf, which the PPP was more than willing to agree to. Under pressure, Musharraf finally resigned on August 18, 2008. Zardari, who had so far stayed in the background, now decided to play a public role, and was soon elected as the new president. This was the long-running political crisis that the Obama administration inherited. Pakistan, the supply chain of the U.S.-led war in Afghanistan, was undergoing a deep political, economic, and social upheaval. Meanwhile, Obama was priming his administration to push Pakistan harder in dealing with the Afghan Taliban it was hosting. On the campaign trail, he had talked about the importance of Pakistan, but he knew his options were limited. Make no mistake, we can't succeed in Afghanistan or secure our homeland unless we change our Pakistan policy. The greatest threat to that security lies in the tribal regions of Pakistan, where terrorists train and insurgents strike into Afghanistan, he said in July 2008. We cannot tolerate a terrorist sanctuary, and as president, I won't. Fatah was now the main base for al-Qaeda and Western jihadis, who were coming there in ever-increasing numbers to receive training. The Americans were deeply worried that the Pakistan Army was mounting all too few operations in Fatah, that it was instead striking peace deals with militants who refrained from attacking Pakistani forces but eagerly attacked U.S. forces in Afghanistan, and that it refused to disturb the Haqqani network in North Waziristan. Admiral Mike Mullen, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, made it his personal mission to build a relationship with Kayani and persuade him to take the high road. He invested much time and energy in it. In late September 2008, Kayani reappointed 2 generals whom he considered his most effective and loyal officers. Lieutenant General Ahmed Shuja Pasha became head of the ISI, replacing Lieutenant General Nadim Taj, a Musharraf loyalist, and Major General Tariq Khan became head of the Frontier Corps, FC. Pasha was a graduate of the German Staff College and spoke German fluently. He and Kayani had been joined at the hip when dealing with the U.S. military and the CIA, trying to mollify them while refusing to yield to their demands to do more. Kayani was to extend Pasha's tenure twice, and even after Osama bin Laden was killed in Pakistan and politicians demanded Pasha's head, he refused to let him resign. Tariq Khan was to do an excellent job in turning around the paramilitary and largely Pashtun FC, which was underpaid and overworked, raising its morale and providing it with better equipment through U.S. support. The militants showed their disregard for the new government in September by exploding a massive truck bomb that blew up the Marriott Hotel in Islamabad, killing 53 people and injuring 266. The blast was heard 30 miles away, and fire gutted the whole building. In October, another suicide attack in Fatah, aimed at anti-Taliban tribal elders, killed 85 and wounded 200 tribesmen. The country was on fire. Then the far worse attack in Mumbai, India, carried out by Pakistan's Lashkar-e-Taiba, set the world alight as India alleged the involvement of the ISI. Kayani did not immediately respond by taking action in Fatah, so Washington delayed sending promised arms and releasing funds to the military. In his first meeting with the civilian government in June, Mullen made it clear that the United States perceived the threat from Fatah. "I believe fundamentally, if the United States is going to get hit, it's going to come out of the planning that the leadership of al-Qaeda in the Fatah is generating, their planning and direction," he said. As had been secretly agreed by the U.S. administration when Obama ordered the first surge of U.S. troops to Afghanistan, the CIA stepped up drone missile attacks, firing off 22 missiles in the last 4 months of 2008, compared to 12 in the first 8 months. But these attacks did not alter the balance of power in Fatah, where the Taliban and al-Qaeda still ruled. Pakistan was now inescapably becoming an unstable state, a continuing supporter of the Afghan Taliban, even as the army went up against its homegrown Pakistani Taliban. The army had clearly underestimated Obama's resolve to deal more harshly with Pakistan than Bush had ever done. Yet as Obama sent more troops and aid to Afghanistan, Americans had started to ask why he was doing so, when the real problem was in Pakistan. President Zardari and the civilian government, although dependent on American support, did not want to risk antagonizing the army. On the contrary, he yielded to the army on every count, even as his government demonstrated more and more ineptitude. The army was determined to prevent any U.S. military presence on its soil. It would remain hostile to India and protect Pakistan's sovereignty, even though foreign extremists like al-Qaeda had long ago broken such boundaries. Chapter 3. Pakistan. Who betrayed whom? At the heart of Pakistan's rapid decline, its worsening relations with the West and neighboring countries, and its image as the center of global terrorism, is the Army's continued reliance on proxy jihadi forces. Some of them are ready to carry out the state's bidding, but others will just as easily turn against the military. In the 1990s, their main target was Indian Kashmir, but when the Taliban emerged, Pakistani militants went to Kandahar to fight for them. The United States was embarrassed but shrugged its shoulders. The Clinton administration had no policy toward Pakistan or Afghanistan in the 1990s. India could look after itself, and if Pakistan considered India its long-term foe, there was nothing much the Clinton White House wanted to do about it. But after September 11th, everything changed, except Pakistan's policies. Pakistan's strategic location, which should have been a vital economic asset to the country, was now a liability, as it became the central hub for the U.S. war in Afghanistan, and as jihadis from surrounding countries flocked there. Pakistan's new global identity was not as a model of innovation or modernity, but as a refuge for multiple extremist groups. A decade after 9/11, its failure to address the extremist threat culminated in the breakdown of its relations with the United States and NATO. I outlined in detail the role of the Afghan and Pakistani Taliban in Pakistan in descent into chaos, but much of the blame must be laid on the Bush administration, whose sole focus was catching al-Qaeda, even though more American troops were dying at the hands of the Taliban than al-Qaeda. President Musharraf had agreed with Bush to provide intelligence on al-Qaeda, which the ISI did, but as far as the Taliban were concerned, there was no such agreement or commitment. It took 4 years after the Taliban insurgency restarted for the White House to begin to take the Taliban as a serious threat. Ryan Crocker, the last Bush administration ambassador to Pakistan, told me in 2007, just before he left Islamabad, that he had never received an order from Washington to raise the issue of Taliban sanctuaries with the Pakistanis. Pakistan had first used proxy forces just after it gained independence in 1947, when it sent thousands of Pakistani Pashtun tribesmen to battle Indian forces in Kashmir, triggering the First India-Pakistan War. 60 years later, the grandchildren of those Pashtuns would be urged to go kill Americans in Afghanistan. In 1962, following India's defeat by China, the military regime of General Ayub Khan secretly sent several thousand soldiers, disguised as guerrillas, to stir up rebellion among the population in Indian Kashmir. Codenamed Operation Gibraltar, the infiltration was a failure, but it led to the second all-out war between the two countries, which Pakistan lost. In 1971, the army created similar proxy forces in East Pakistan, now Bangladesh, in order to help it subdue the separatist Bengali insurgency, which was being backed by India. These proxy forces, some Bengali but mostly Urdu-speaking Biharis, as well as cadres of the Jamaat-e-Islami, carried out several massacres. Pakistan's defeat by India and the loss of East Pakistan, half the country, created strong feelings of humiliation within the military, which encouraged it to continue using proxies as an effective tool to weaken India and achieve revenge. The military was to further bankroll the Sikh insurgency in Indian Punjab and, over the years, several tribal uprisings in northeastern India. A vicious tit-for-tat ensued, as India in turn funded and supported Baluch, Sindhi, and Pashtun separatists in the 1970s and later. Baluchistan has undergone 5 insurgencies. In the 1980s, India backed the pro-Soviet communist regime in Kabul, which launched its own terrorist campaign in northwestern Pakistan to counter the presence of the Afghan Mujahideen. Also in the 1980s, the ISI made a bold move to exert distributive control over billions of dollars in arms supplies and cash supplied by the CIA for the Mujahideen. Military dictator President Zia-ul-Haq stipulated to President Reagan that if Pakistan were given total control of the CIA program and funds, it would only risk the wrath of the Soviet Union. The Americans complied, and the ISI expanded enormously, becoming not just the arbiter of foreign policy through its covert programs, but also the most powerful and intrusive political player in the country. Up to 30,000 foreign jihadis came to fight alongside the Mujahideen, and many of them were to stay on in Pakistan. The military took enormous credit for the defeat and breakup of the Soviet Union. After 9/11, Pakistan believed it could carry on in a similar way with the Americans, help out the CIA with al-Qaeda, but assert its sovereignty and carry on with its own agenda in Kashmir and Afghanistan. In 1989, the ISI used the residue of U.S. funds for Afghanistan to support a mass movement in Kashmir against India that would last a decade. Many of Pakistan's generals were to remain influenced by the expansionist foreign policy and the use of jihadis cultivated by Zia-ul-Haq, who took the country literally from one jihad to the next without a break. Several Pakistani militant groups such as Harkat-ul-Jihad al-Islami, founded in 1984, and Lashkar-e-Taiba, founded in 1982, were born in the crucible of the anti-Soviet Afghan War, before moving on to greater exploits in Kashmir in the 1990s. At home, there was a rapid growth in madrasas, weaponization, drugs, and crime, making these groups self-sufficient, as ISI funding for extremist groups was reduced. As long as the Indian giant remained cowed and pro-Pakistan forces were successful in Afghanistan, no Pakistani government came up with plans to de-radicalize the militants and to undertake economic and educational reforms. Pakistan began to lose control of these groups in 1997, when the Taliban leader Mullah Muhammad Omar handed over all training camps for foreigners in Afghanistan to Osama bin Laden. In these camps, Kashmiri and Pakistani extremists mixed with young militants from all over the Muslim world and from Europe, just as an earlier generation had done in the 1980s in Afghanistan. Al-Qaeda's indoctrination had an enormous impact on them. Some embraced the idea of global jihad, joined Al-Qaeda, and went on to provide it with skills and facilities. Both before and after 9/11, all Pakistani insurgent groups used Afghanistan as an arena for virtual battle experience, increasing their militancy, raising their numbers, and sharpening their skills. These Pakistani groups would later turn against the regime in Islamabad and flourish as the Pakistani Taliban. After the defeat of the Taliban after 9/11 in Afghanistan, Musharraf and the military began the long process, overseen by the Americans, of capturing and killing Arab al-Qaeda members who had fled to Pakistan. The United States gave cash rewards to Pakistani security officers who had been involved in actions to kill and capture members of al-Qaeda. A tiny minority of Pakistani officers from the ISI and from Pakistan's special forces had jihadist sympathies and disagreed with this policy. They left the army and joined militant groups. They too became important to al-Qaeda, for they organized some of the deadliest attacks against the Pakistan army, starting with 2 attempts to assassinate Musharraf in December 2003 that almost succeeded. Musharraf's determination to wipe out al-Qaeda and its growing Pakistani support base was undercut by his double-edged policy of helping the Afghan Taliban relaunch their insurgency in Afghanistan. Paramount in the military's thinking was the fear of India encircling Pakistan first from its eastern borders and now along its western borders. He based this contradictory initiative on several strategic assumptions made by the ISI, that the Afghan Pashtuns, whom Pakistan favored, had lost their dominance to the non-Pashtun warlords of the Northern Alliance, whom the United States favored, that the United States would quickly leave Afghanistan after its invasion of Iraq, that the United States would give India increasing influence in Afghanistan and would eventually dump Pakistan, as it had after the Soviet withdrawal in 1989, and that the pro-Indian Kabul regime would help India undermine Pakistan's western borders. With these assumptions in mind, Musharraf's next step was to ensure that the Afghan Taliban remained a proxy force for Pakistan, and to persuade their defeated and dispirited units to unite and relaunch an insurgency in Afghanistan. Even though many Taliban preferred making their peace with Karzai, the ISI persuaded them not to do so once the insurgency began. The ISI helped the Taliban raise funds in the Arabian Gulf states and facilitated their acquisition of guns and ammunition. It set up training camps manned by its own officers in Baluchistan province, where many Taliban leaders had settled. It set up a secret organization to run the Taliban, even as it was cooperating with the CIA in apprehending al-Qaeda. Retired Army and ISI officers, operating outside the traditional military structures, manned the secret organization. For several years, the United States failed to detect this support base or understand how it operated. The main Taliban under Mullah Omar set up offices in Quetta and Peshawar. Its leaders in Quetta directed the insurgency in southern Afghanistan. Another Afghan Taliban ally, Gulbuddin Hekmatyar's Hezb-e-Islami Party, operated out of northern Pakistan. From their bases in Pakistan, the Taliban launched attacks into Afghanistan while recruiting Pakistani Pashtuns to provide them with base security and additional manpower, even as they radicalized them for their cause. Thus were born the Pakistani Taliban in Fatah. They were local Pakistani Pashtun tribesmen who became radicalized after spending years in the company of either al-Qaeda or the Afghan Taliban, and receiving generous payments for services rendered. At first, Musharraf ignored the threat, and the army went into denial mode about the existence of any terrorist bases in Fatah. Finally, in March 2004, under U.S. pressure, Musharraf launched the first attack against the Pakistani Taliban in South Waziristan. But the poorly trained and armed Frontier Corps units walked into an ambush and lost some 200 men. The next month, the army signed a peace agreement with the Pakistani Taliban leader Nek Mohammed. This pattern of attacking and then surrendering ground through a so-called peace treaty established a losing pattern for the army for the rest of the decade. Throughout this period, the veteran Afghan anti-Soviet fighter Jalaluddin Haqqani played a critical role for the army, creating temporary ceasefires or bringing Pakistani Taliban to talks with the military. The tribal agencies of Fatah were dominated by the network led by Haqqani and his sons. Haqqani was based in the town of Miran Shah, the capital of the North Waziristan tribal agency, but the Afghan Taliban and Pakistani militants who came to operate from other parts of Fatah all paid homage to Haqqani. He had become extremely close to both the ISI and Al-Qaeda in the 1980s, and was honored even by the Americans for his fierce fighting against the Soviets. He subsequently joined the Taliban movement in 1994, and became a minister in the Taliban government in Kabul in 1996. After 9/11, the CIA and ISI tried to persuade him to withdraw his support from the Taliban and Al-Qaeda, but he refused to do so. His present influence in Afghanistan is largely in three of the eastern Pashtun provinces, Khost, Paktika, and Paktia. With the army's intense focus on the future of Afghanistan and the threat it now faced from homegrown Taliban, Musharraf began secret negotiations with the Indians. In 2004, both countries agreed to a ceasefire along the disputed line of control, the border that divided Indian Kashmir from Pakistani Kashmir. Significantly, that ceasefire has held ever since, even though both countries still maintain large numbers of troops on the border. As a result, young Punjabi militants from parties that had once fought in Kashmir became frustrated, split away from their mother parties, and came to Fatah to fight for the Afghan Taliban. The tribal agencies were soon littered with camps of Punjabi militants who had received Haqqani's permission to set up shop. In Fatah, they underwent further radicalization and were provoked by U.S. drone strikes and by the Red Mosque siege to take up arms against Pakistan. The conviction spread among them that the Pakistan army was the lackey of the Americans and an enemy of Islam. So now God ordained them to overthrow Pakistan's state through an Islamic revolution. The ISI lost control over these groups, which killed and bombed their way through Pakistan's cities, targeting specifically the offices of the ISI and other intelligence agencies. Only Lashkar-e-Taiba, LT, by now the largest, best disciplined, and most highly trained extremist party, with some support in the army itself, remained loyal to the state and sought to fight only India. But even LT leaders came under pressure from their cadres to fight the Americans, and so, by 2009, its leaders allowed a limited number of young fighters to play a role in Afghanistan. Over the next few years, Fatah was to turn into a battleground, but the army remained extremely selective about whom it went after. It hunts down only those who oppose the Pakistani state. It allows Afghan Taliban such as Jalaluddin Haqqani, who remains loyal to Pakistan, to thrive in North Waziristan. Likewise, it leaves alone Pakistani Taliban commanders such as Hafiz Gul Bahadur and Maulvi Nazir from South Waziristan, who only fight U.S. forces in Afghanistan. Such dubious deals cannot be sustained, as under such a regime everyone thrives, including those militants determined to destroy Pakistan. Recently, the United States has pressured Pakistan to go after the Afghan Taliban and the Haqqani network, but given Pakistan's critical role in the U.S. war effort in Afghanistan, it was reluctant to push too hard. Initially, some 80% of the American military goods and fuel bound for U.S. and NATO troops in Afghanistan arrived at the port of Karachi and underwent a long truck drive through Pakistan to reach either Kandahar via Quetta and Chaman in Baluchistan or Kabul via Peshawar in the Khyber Pass. In 2009, despite numerous attacks on truck convoys by Pakistani Taliban and bandits, the United States still moved most of its cargo through Pakistan. But the strains on the relationship were forcing the Americans to look elsewhere, because periodically, when relations between U.S. and Pakistani forces on the Afghan border became tense, Pakistan would shut down the NATO traffic. By the summer of 2011, 50% of supplies had been redirected through the Northern Distribution Network, a patchwork of rail and road routes through Russia, Siberia, Central Asia, and the Caucasus. 1/3 of supplies now pass through Azerbaijan, while the rest is carried from the European Baltic ports through Russia and Central Asia. U.S. military planners have swiftly reduced the supplies going through Pakistan, just as the two countries' relations have started to fall apart. The relationships and alliances grew ever more complicated and confusing. The ISI continued to provide the CIA with intelligence on al-Qaeda and on Western jihadis, large numbers of whom were still arriving in Fatah for training. Most contentious of all, the ISI cooperated with the CIA in allowing missiles fired by Predator drones to target high-level al-Qaeda and later Pakistani Taliban in Fatah. The CIA ran the Pakistani airbase at Shamsi in Baluchistan province, so some of the drones that killed militants in Fatah actually took off from Pakistani soil. The drones have become the target of widespread public anger at the government, the army, and the Americans. Drone strikes began in June 2004, and during the Bush administration, which ended in January 2009, a total of only 44 were fired. Obama sees them as a strategic rather than a tactical weapon, and has authorized 4 times as many, or 1 strike every 4 days. Pakistani critics maintain that while the drones kill militants, they also kill hundreds of civilians. The Americans have tried to downplay this and claim only a few dozen civilians as the strikes become more accurate. As of July 2011, 250 drone strikes have killed between 1,500 and 2,300 people. Of those who died, only an estimated 33 were known terrorist leaders. When the CIA has insufficient intelligence, it conducts what it calls signature strikes, aimed at killing clusters of people whose identities are not known, but who are considered likely enemy. The United States makes no attempt to justify these strikes as self-defense, or to consider that innocent people are being killed. The drone program is controlled by the CIA's Counterterrorism Center, CTC, which had 300 employees in 2001, but has grown to more than 2,000 by 2011. Because of its high level of operational secrecy, those running the drone program are almost unaccountable except to the CIA itself. The CIA has expanded beyond intelligence gathering and analysis to become a military force capable of making decisions as to who should live and die, without the accountability that the U.S. Army would have to face in similar circumstances. In 2011, the CIA is running 30 Predator and Reaper drones, a network of Pakistani agents inside Fatah to provide targeting information, and a clandestine Afghan militia that enters Pakistan to provide intelligence on the Taliban. Earlier U.S. agreements with Pakistan about where and how many drones would be fired no longer hold, and in 2011, Pakistan has demanded futilely that all drone strikes cease. Both sides are trapped in their own double-dealing. The Americans cannot discuss drones because they are a classified CIA operation, while Pakistan pretends it never sanctioned the drones or provided intelligence to the United States for fear of riling up the militants and the public. As a result, the Americans can conveniently ignore Pakistan's demands, while Pakistan can do nothing to counter the public's strong anti-American sentiment and the militants' conviction that the Army is providing intelligence to the Americans. The U.S.-Pakistan agreements over the use of drones should have been made partially public to show that this is a joint program and that the drones are strictly targeting militant leaders. Instead, the lies on both sides have piled up until the entire justification of the program has collapsed. The program has no legitimacy for Pakistanis, and the same goes for international human rights groups. Even in Washington, the CIA's authority over the drones has left the State Department out on a limb, because while state may have been pursuing talks with the Taliban, the CIA was bombing them. In 2010, as violence by the Taliban intensified in both countries, more Pakistanis were asking why the military had pursued a policy of subterfuge with its own people for so many years. The principal reason was to keep India off balance, and to keep India's influence in Afghanistan constantly under threat. In the mid-1990s, when the Pakistan-backed guerrilla war in Indian Kashmir was at its height, a Pakistani general explained to me the war's strategic value. It kept 700,000 Indian troops and paramilitary forces in Kashmir at very low cost to Pakistan. At the same time, it ensured that the Indian Army could not threaten Pakistan, created enormous expenditures for India, and kept it bogged down in military and political terms. Rightly or wrongly, this was also the key to Pakistan's strategy in Afghanistan, to keep the pot simmering, but never allow it to come to a boil. In 2008, India signed a nuclear weapons deal with the United States, became wealthy and powerful, received U.S. support for a seat at the UN Security Council, and became the new destination for Western investors. But Pakistan has escalated its fears of the Indian threat. The military has become more reckless in its use of jihadi groups. The Mumbai attack in 2008 by Lashkar-e-Taiba was brazen, as was Pakistan's subsequent refusal to ban LT, or disarm the jihadi groups in Punjab. Likewise, the attacks on the Indian embassy and other facilities in Kabul, which began in 2008, were easily traceable back to the Haqqani network and to intelligence operatives in Pakistan. The Mumbai attack brought India and Pakistan close to war. On November 26, 2008, just 6 weeks before Obama's inauguration, 10 Pakistani terrorists belonging to LT attacked 9 locations, including 3 hotels and a Jewish center in Mumbai, India's largest commercial hub. The attacks and the 60-hour siege killed 160 people, including 12 foreigners and 6 Americans, and wounded 300. One of the gunmen, Ajmal Kasab, a Pakistani from a village near Multan, was captured alive and admitted to being trained by LT and a retired ISI officer in Karachi. India ratcheted up its armed forces readiness, and U.S. Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice and Admiral Mike Mullen rushed to Delhi and Islamabad to try to prevent the war. India demanded that Pakistan hand over suspects who emerged from the interrogation of Kasab. The Pakistanis refused and for months even denied that Pakistanis from LT were involved. For the Americans, Pakistan had suddenly become a deeply untrustworthy and unpredictable ally, while LT had become the new Al-Qaeda, with global jihadist intentions. It is doubtful that the Pakistan military high command was involved in Mumbai, although some elements in the ISI may have been. The terrorists' aim was to create a war situation with India, to relieve the army's attacks on the Pakistani Taliban in Fatah. Indian Prime Minister Manmohan Singh had to exert considerable pressure to restrain the hawkish elements that wanted to punish Pakistan. However, India broke off all talks with Pakistan. When Obama appointed Richard Holbrooke AFPAC Special Envoy, he initially tasked him with trying to bring India and Pakistan to a peaceful understanding, or at least to the table to talk. India raised objections, saying it would not be tied to Pakistan in any AFPAC formula. Indian officials arrived in Washington and berated Secretary of State Hillary Clinton and Holbrooke. Unwilling to risk a break with India, the State Department immediately demurred, saying that Holbrooke would not be mediating between the two countries, but would only keep India informed of progress in AFPAC. Obama succumbed and took India off the Holbrooke beat. Thus, Holbrooke's attempts to find a regional settlement for Afghanistan were hobbled from the start. For Pakistan's military and public, it was a massive letdown. An Obama promise had been made and then broken. It spelled the beginning of the end of Pakistani trust in Obama. To the military, it showed Obama to be weak, vacillating, and untrustworthy, and it confirmed for many Pakistanis that the United States would always buckle in the face of Indian pressure and change its policy goalposts for the sake of India. The Pakistani media became increasingly anti-American, depicting Pakistan's sacrifices in the war on terror and the lack of U.S. appreciation for them. Pakistanis began to compare India with Israel, which could do no wrong in American eyes, and Pakistan with the Palestinians, to whom the Americans always gave short shrift. The Obama administration's missteps and Pakistan's over-expectant hopes contributed to the breakdown of relations in 2011. The American answer to the proxy war between India and Pakistan and Afghanistan was tepid and devoid of strategic thinking. In a crisis such as the one generated by the Mumbai attacks, U.S. diplomacy did play a major role in getting both sides to climb down from a war. But the United States refused to get involved in moving the two countries toward peace and a settlement of their rivalry. Pakistan had long argued that its need for strategic depth to counter India necessitated its interference in Afghanistan. In other words, Pakistan needed a friendly government in Kabul that, in case of war with India, would give its army support and space. By 2001, however, many Pakistani retired officers and academics had exploded that thesis as meaningless. The fact that both countries now brandished nuclear weapons made strategic depth irrelevant. Nobody would have time to look for it, just before or after a nuclear war. Nonetheless, even after 9/11, the U.S. military looked with great sympathy on Pakistan's thesis. Pakistan has continued to try to retain some level of parity with India in both its conventional armaments and its nuclear weapons. However, the irony is that Pakistan has carried out its aims of parity with India by using U.S. aid and carrying out Washington's bidding in the region. According to Pakistan historian Farzana Sheikh, it is then Pakistan's rivalry with India that has facilitated U.S. intervention in Pakistan, intervention largely encouraged by Pakistan's dominant military. In this